cards. Here for more on the president's diplomatic efforts is member of the House Foreign Relations Committee, Republican Congressman from Illinois, Rep Kinzinger. Congressman, I want to start with the president's trip to the NATO summit. There's been a lot of criticism and accusations that the president only managed to alienate our allies. How do you see it?
So I'm kind of mixed on it. You know, on the one hand, I remember reading about when Ronald Reagan was elected, people always said, oh, he's just going to tick off the Europeans. The Europeans didn't like his attitude, and he turned out to be pretty solid. I do think going to NATO kind of with this, you know, guns blazing thing isn't the best approach. I do think it's essential for the president to make the point that you've got to pay your fair share. You've got to pay your fair share into your military budget so you can do a lot of these operations. But I would have liked to see him also reinforce NATO and saying, thank you for the only time that you ever invoked Article 5 being in defense of this country. And I also have to say, I was actually really impressed, not necessarily with the delivery per se, but with the fact that he brought up the Nord Stream 2 pipeline with Germany.
Yeah.
That is a serious issue right now, and it's what the Russians are using to further basically enslave politically Eastern Europe.
Yeah, I mentioned on yesterday's show, he made a lot of good points. It was the way he made them that I think ruffled a lot of people's feathers. And I guess he could leave saying he got what he asked for in that some of the NATO countries have agreed to get back up to 2%. But at what cost? I don't have to tell you how intrinsic our pact with Europe is to democracy and economic stability. Are you concerned that he's eroded that?
Maybe. Again, I find myself even debating within, you know, what's the benefit of this? I do think NATO needs shooken up a little bit. It needs somebody to basically grab these countries by the collar and say, you have got to step up your defense too. As James Mattis said, nobody cares about your country more than you do. Nobody cares about your children more than you do. And so if he can kind of go in and shake people a little bit, that's one thing. Where the long-term concern is trying to remind the importance to our European partners of NATO. Yeah. The reality is we get a ton out of NATO. Our trading relationships that have come from the stability that NATO provides, keeping Russia inside its borders, not going into the Baltics. This is very important. So I think history will judge how this is. Yeah. Like I said, for me, a little concerned with the tone, but I also think the message actually needs to be delivered.
So let's talk about the president's upcoming meeting with Vladimir Putin. There's a lot on the table. For starters, what do you hope he says to Putin about election meddling?
Oh, I hope he brings it up. You know, don't meddle in our election. I hope he talks a lot about Syria, talks about Ukraine, talks about the fact that they occupy a third of Georgia, talks about the hospitals that are being bombed every day in Syria by Russian military. When we accidentally bombed a hospital in Afghanistan, it was world news for like a week, and we apologized and did everything to find out why that accidentally happened. They're doing this intentionally. So I hope these issues are brought up. He can come out of a meeting and say, you know, we had a very good meeting. There's no problem with that, as long as he expresses those concerns, because the image of him coming out and throwing bombs at NATO and then praising Vladimir Putin would have a much bigger impact.
Well, specifically, what should, you know, if you were traveling with the president and advising him, what should he specifically ask Vladimir Putin about Crimea, for starters?
Well, I would make the point that these sanctions are going to stay until they get out of Crimea, which was illegally annexed by the Russians. The fact is, in eastern Ukraine, there is a war still going on, even though it's not getting a lot of attention. Vladimir Putin denies that it's his troops. He says it's this magical, you know, militia that popped up out of the ground. So I think calling him out on that and stressing that the sanctions are going to get tougher and tighter, and we're not screwing around. And by the way, when your mercenaries in Syria try to attack a base that the United States military's on, we're going to kill a couple hundred of you like we did.
Well, so, and on Syria, issue I know you care a lot about, what would you ask, what would you want Trump to ask Putin to commit to when it comes to Syria and Assad?
Well, here's what I would love. I would love him to ask Putin to commit to overthrowing Assad and working with all the partners together for a Syria that's going to be messy in the short term. I don't know how it can get much messier than it is now. What I think realistically he could do is use Russia's help to extract Iran, but without giving concessions on the U.S. side. There's discussions of leaving bases that we have there fighting ISIS and blocking Iran's position to Israel. That cannot be on the table. We can't leave the base in Al-Tanf, for instance, which we're using to block Iranian movement of goods and material.
Finally, Trump has said he views Vladimir Putin as a competitor. How do you think Putin views Trump?
Oh, an enemy. I mean, I think there's no doubt Russia sees the United States as being the reason Russia's not great anymore. So he views the United States as an enemy. Not that he wants to go to war with us, because he'd be handily defeated. But I think going into that, I don't care if you call him competitor, enemy, or whatever, the president needs to go in, and I'm hopeful that he is, to go in and understand that Putin is not his friend, and frankly, he cannot be trusted. This is a guy that bombs hospitals by his authority every day, hospitals with children in them.
Yeah. Congressman Kinzinger, as always, thanks for joining me.
Anytime, Messi. See ya.
Okay.